Hey everyone, what is it that you have anchored yourself into? It's really an important question for us to think about because what we've anchored ourselves into ultimately determines what our hope is in. So if I've anchored myself into my marriage and then the person I'm married to lets me down, which they will, then all of a sudden what I thought was secure becomes insecure. If I anchor myself into the success of my children and then they don't do what I would hope that they would do, whether in behavior or accomplishment or whatever it might be, then my hope that I thought was secure is now insecure. If I anchor myself into my job or my career and then something happens to where I can't do that anymore, or there's changes and I lose my job, then what I thought was a hope secured becomes insecure. I think you get the pattern. And that's why it's super important for us to consider, what have we anchored ourselves into? And we don't often think about this. We think about where we have our eyes fixed or where our focus is, but what are we anchoring ourselves into will determine whether we are a hopeful people or generally a hopeless people. And maybe hope is something you've experienced as a temporary emotion rather than a sure foundation. And so our passage in Hebrews chapter 6 and chapter 7 talked about that we have this sure and steady anchor of the soul, a hope that enters in behind the curtain where Jesus has gone as a forerunner and he remains. And so that hope remains. The hope that's available through Jesus is a hope in the promises God has made, of which he will come through on. His purposes remain. And so a hope anchored in that through Jesus is not going to let us down. The question is, will we actually anchor ourselves through Christ in the promises of God? This week, I'm going to encourage you to reflect on what you have anchored yourself into, and then to think about how can you anchor yourself into that which lasts, not in the temporary. And to do that is going to take some intentionality, because sometimes we have our anchor really set in something that won't last, and that's why we're drifting. And so it takes us doing the work to get our anchor untethered from that and moved over to something that actually is firm and secure. That can start by us knowing what God has promised, which takes reading his word. It can start by us devoting ourselves to prayer, because we know that that's where our hope lies. And then reminding ourselves, taking a Philippians 4 type mindset, to focus on what's good, what's lovely, what's pure, what's righteous, if there's anything worthy of praise, to set our minds on those things, reminding ourselves what the promises of God are. Maybe even devoting ourselves to some scripture memory, because I need to have this database of God's promises right at hand, so that when I'm prone to anchor myself into something that doesn't last, my mind reminds me, the hope and truth of Scripture reminds me of what does. So this week, challenge you to consider what you've anchored yourself into, and then to make the shift to anchor yourself through Christ in the promises of God, knowing they're secure. Have a great week, everyone.